I moved here for peace. What I got instead was a shredded Porsche, a fake citation on my windshield, and two HOA thugs with tactical vests telling me to park somewhere more appropriate. It would have been laughable if they hadn't slashed $5,000 worth of tires and smiled while doing it. Drop a comment if your HOA ever tried playing police. These guys wore mock uniforms, carried pepper spray, and talked like they had jurisdiction. But what they didn't know was this: I don't file complaints. I build cases. I've spent 15 years chasing fugitives across state lines. And this little stunt? They just upgraded from vandalism to federal impersonation of federal officers. That Porsche? It wasn't just a car. It was bait. And they took it hard. They think I'm just another neighbor with a fancy car. What I'm about to do next? Let's just say, the HOA is going to need a lawyer. 15 years as a U.S. Marshal had taught me patience, tracking fugitives across state lines, coordinating with local authorities, building cases that would stand up in court. All of it required a level head and the ability to see the bigger picture. So, when I moved to Oak Ridge Estates after a shoulder injury from my last assignment, I thought I was prepared for anything. The injury had been bad, a takedown gone wrong that left me with physical scars and the occasional nightmare. My supervisor suggested a quieter posting while I recovered, and I jumped at the chance. After years of living out of hotel rooms and chasing dangerous criminals, I wanted some peace. The silver Porsche 911 Carrera was my reward to myself, a reminder that I'd survived. It represented more than luxury. It was a promise that life could still hold beauty after witnessing so much ugliness. The first sign of trouble came the day after I moved in. As I was arranging my modest furniture in the living room, I caught a glimpse of movement through my window. An older woman was standing on the sidewalk, photographing my car with a small digital camera. I stepped outside, my Marshal's instincts making me cautious but friendly. "Good afternoon," I said, extending my hand. "I'm St. Harold, just moved in." The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Wilson, gave my hand a limp shake while her eyes darted back to my car. "That's quite a statement piece you have there," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "We have rules about appropriate vehicles in Oak Ridge. I'm on the HOA board, you know." I smiled politely, already reaching for the folder I'd prepared. "Yes, I know. I actually received approval for my car before purchasing the property. All the documentation is right here." I handed her the papers, which she reluctantly scanned. Her mouth tightened into a thin line as she handed them back. "Well, we'll see," she muttered, before turning on her heel. That night, I woke in a cold sweat, remnants of a nightmare about my last assignment still clinging to my consciousness. As I splashed water on my face in the bathroom, I looked out the window and saw Margaret's silhouette framed in her upstairs window, still watching my house. Something primal stirred in me, an instinct honed through years of high-stakes operations that told me I was being targeted. I pushed the feeling down, reminding myself I was here for peace, not conflict. Still, the Marshal in me couldn't help but take note of the potential threat. The next morning, a fake violation was taped to my windshield. It looked official, red ink, fake formatting, but had no legal weight, another scare tactic. I took a photo and filed it with my notes. My answer came that very night. A faint noise outside woke me instantly. Years of training had made me a light sleeper. I moved silently to the window, my injured shoulder protesting slightly as I pulled back the curtain. Two figures were hunched beside my car, their faces obscured in the darkness. That night, my camera caught two figures sneaking around my Porsche. By morning, fresh scratches. That was the first open shot in a war I hadn't asked for. The next day, instead of heading to the local body shop, I went to a hardware store. By evening, I started documenting. Old instincts kicked in, folders, maps, timelines. Peace was off the table. This was turning into a case. And if there's one thing a U.S. Marshal knows how to do, it's build a case. Whoever was behind this would soon learn they'd picked the wrong target. My old partner Daniel stopped by. Caldwell? Ex-cop. Walked away dirty but never charged. Now he plays king here. The pieces were falling into place. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center looked more like a small courthouse than a meeting space. The room was arranged with an elevated desk at the front, behind which sat a man I immediately identified as Richard Caldwell. Despite being only 40, his bearing suggested someone accustomed to wielding authority. He sat with the confident posture of a man who expected, no, demanded, respect. occasionally tapping an actual gavel against the wooden deck. A crowd of about 30 residents sat in neat rows, their body language submissive and uncomfortable. I took a seat in the back, observing. At 40, Caldwell should have been in the prime of his career as a police chief. Instead, he was here, playing judge in a suburban HOA. The fall from grace must have been significant, and wounded pride can make people dangerous. Before we move to tonight's agenda, Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of his former profession, I'd like to welcome our newest resident, the federal agent with the fancy sports car. All eyes turned to me, and I maintained a neutral expression as Caldwell continued. In light of recent concerns about vehicles that may distract from our community standards, the board is proposing a new bylaw regarding appropriate transportation within Oak Ridge. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd pointed directly at my Porsche. During the open comments section, I approached the microphone, prepared to calmly address the scratch incident and question the new proposed bylaw. Before I could speak more than a few words, Caldwell rapped his gavel sharply. I'm afraid we need to move on with the agenda, he announced with a practiced, almost paternal smile to the crowd. As I returned to my seat, I noticed how the residents shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. The dynamics were becoming clear. Caldwell had everyone intimidated. After the meeting, as I walked to my car, 2 men intercepted me in the parking lot. They wore uniforms that closely resembled police attire, complete with tactical pants, utility belts carrying handcuffs and pepper spray, and badges that, to my trained eye, were clearly designed to mimic law enforcement credentials without quite crossing the legal line. Evening, Marshal, the taller one said, deliberately standing too close. Trevor Watson, Community Shield Security. This is my brother Kyle. We handle HOA enforcement around here. His hand rested casually on his pepper spray canister, a gesture meant to intimidate. It's quite a car you've got, Kyle added, circling to my other side. Your kind of car attracts the wrong element to our community. Shame if anything happened to it. The threat was anything but subtle. Instead of confronting them, I simply nodded and continued to my car, seemingly checking messages on my phone. In reality, I was taking discreet photos of their uniforms, badges, and equipment. Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal offense, and these 2 were dancing right on the line. As they watched me drive away, I could feel their eyes on my back, confident in their ability to intimidate another resident. They had no idea. They just provided evidence for what was rapidly becoming a federal case file. The next morning, I found my garbage cans overturned despite being properly placed according to HOA guidelines. As I was setting them right, my neighbor across the street, a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Eliza Chen, approached cautiously. They do that sometimes, she said quietly, glancing around as if worried about being overheard. The HOA patrol, I mean. I saw their SUV drive by around 5 this morning. I thanked her for the information, noting how she seemed simultaneously helpful and frightened. How long have you lived here? I asked conversationally. About 8 months, she replied. It's not what I expected. Before she could elaborate, a black SUV with Community Shield Security emblazoned on the side drove slowly past my house, both Watson brothers visibly watching us. Eliza quickly excused herself and hurried back to her home. The intimidation tactics were affecting the entire neighborhood, not just me. At 2:15, night vision captured them crouched under my Porsche, gesturing like engineers. One held a small box. No need to guess twice. They weren't just watching anymore, they were hunting. This wasn't just harassment anymore, they were looking for something specific. But what did they think I had? My reflection in the computer screen showed a face transformed. No longer the patient homeowner, but the federal agent I was trained to be. The slight tremor in my hands wasn't from fear, but from a focused anger and the rush of adrenaline that came with it. I moved to my home office and pinned an index card to the wall. The beginning of an investigation board that would soon grow. What are they looking for? I wrote on it, the first piece in what would become a complex puzzle. Over the next few days, I began discreetly investigating Richard Caldwell and his security team. Property records showed that Caldwell had moved to Oak Ridge 5 years ago, shortly after resigning as police chief of a small town 30 miles away, amid allegations of evidence tampering and extortion. Though never formally charged, the cloud of suspicion had effectively ended his law enforcement career. The Watson brothers had both failed the police academy entrance exams multiple times. Their father had been a decorated officer, killed in the line of duty when they were teenagers, a trauma that seemingly fueled their desperate need to wear a uniform and carry a badge, even if both were counterfeit. This information painted a clear picture of wounded pride and redirected ambition, dangerous motivations that often drove people to abuse whatever power they could obtain. My security system alerted me to movement outside again 3 nights later. This time, Trevor Watson was placing another warning notice on my door, identical to the first but now with TW $150 fine stamped across it in red. This citation had no legal standing, but it mimicked official documentation perfectly. Another intimidation tactic designed to frighten residents into compliance. I added it to my growing evidence file, my jaw tightening as I reviewed the camera footage again. The Watson brothers' SUV now drove past my house several times daily, slowing conspicuously each time. They were escalating their harassment, confident in their ability to force me out, as they apparently had done with others. Little did they know, they were only strengthening my resolve and providing more evidence for the case I was building against them. After a 3-day work assignment in a neighboring county, I returned home to find an official-looking violation notice with a $500 fine for improper vehicle storage taped to my front door. This document was more elaborate than the previous warnings, featuring a seal that resembled but legally wasn't quite an official government seal. The escalation was clear. They were becoming more aggressive in their intimidation tactics. When I walked to my garage to check on my car, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed, with deep, deliberate cuts that rendered them unrepairable. The security footage told the story. Trevor and Kyle Watson, in their mock police uniforms, had done the damage at 1:30 in the morning. They wore knockoff body cams and announced their violation like performers on a stage. The theatrics would have been laughable if they weren't so infuriating. In the privacy of my garage, I finally lost my composure completely. Years of maintaining control in high-pressure situations disappeared in an instant as I hurled a wrench across the space, shattering a window. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the garage as I stood breathing heavily, staring at my reflection in my car's damaged paint. For a moment, the face looking back was the man who had chased down violent fugitives, not the calm neighbor I'd been pretending to be. I steadied my breath, forcing myself to think like a federal agent, not a furious neighbor. This wasn't just about a car anymore, it was about abuse of power, and that was something I couldn't walk away from. I filed a police report the next day, but the officer who responded, Sarah Jenkins, seemed dismissive from the moment she arrived. "Sounds like you're having some trouble with the HOA," she said, barely glancing at the slashed tires. When I mentioned I had security footage of the Watson brothers committing the vandalism, her demeanor changed subtly. "I'll need a copy of that," she said. But when I provided it, she claimed the file was corrupted. I recognized the brush-off technique. I'd used it myself when jurisdiction issues arose in my own work. There was something more going on here than just an overzealous HOA. Officer Jenkins wore the same insignia pin as I'd seen on Richard Caldwell at the meeting, a connection that didn't escape my notice. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, rolling a glass of whiskey between my palms without drinking it. The room was dark except for the glow of my laptop showing property records. I'd spent the evening researching former Oak Ridge residents, contacting those who had moved away recently. A pattern emerged. Anyone with luxury vehicles or who questioned the HOA faced escalating harassment, until they sold their homes at below-market rates. James Foster, who had moved away 6 months ago, was particularly illuminating. First it was warnings about my Audi, he told me over the phone. Then mysterious damage to my car. After I complained, we had a water main break that flooded our basement. Thousands in damage. The insurance investigator found evidence it had been deliberately tampered with, but the police wouldn't pursue it. We sold at a 30% loss just to escape. Property records revealed something even more disturbing. Most homes sold under duress were purchased by shell companies, all linking back to Caldwell Investment Group. Richard Caldwell wasn't just an ex-cop with control issues. He was systematically forcing people out and acquiring their properties through intimidation. When I parked my car, with expensive new tires, in my garage instead of the driveway, I received another violation notice claiming residential garages must remain available for inspection at reasonable hours. A clause nowhere in the actual bylaws. My wall of evidence grew. Photos, property records, timelines, all methodically arranged and connected with red string, forming a web, with Richard Caldwell at the center. Late that night, my security system alerted me to movement. The footage showed Trevor and Kyle attempting to place something under my car in the garage. Finding it locked, they whispered about planting it tomorrow during the inspection. My blood ran cold as I realized they were planning to plant evidence, possibly drugs. The implications were staggering. If they succeeded, it wouldn't just mean losing my home. It could end my career. Then something shifted within me. I stood, walked to the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. I stared into the laptop screen. The reflection showed someone I hadn't seen in years. Water dripping from my chin, I looked up with renewed determination. The time for passive observation was over. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was conspiracy, fraud, and attempted framing of a federal officer. So that's their game, I whispered. Time to stop playing defense. I added one more note to my investigation wall. Attempted framing. Federal offense. The trap they were setting for me would become the trap I used to catch them. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding a home inspection for potential bylaw violations, scheduled for the following day. I consulted a real estate attorney who confirmed what I already suspected. They had no legal right to enter my home. HOA conflicts can become living nightmares, the attorney warned. Most people just give up and move. I thanked him for his advice but had no intention of backing down. Instead, I began preparing for the inspection not as a homeowner but as a U.S. Marshal, setting up a sting operation. I carefully positioned additional cameras inside my home, focusing particularly on the garage where they had attempted to place something the night before. Eliza Chen approached me as I was checking my mail that afternoon. "I've seen what they're doing to you," she said quietly. "The same thing happened to the Johnson family before you moved in. They had a BMW." I studied her carefully, noting how her eyes constantly scanned the street as she spoke. "You seem to notice a lot," I observed. She shrugged slightly. "I'm observant by nature. It's part of my job." When I asked what she did for a living, her answer surprised me. "I'm a forensic accountant." The pieces clicked into place. Her cautious demeanor, her attention to detail. "We should talk more," I said, handing her my card with my personal number written on the back. "I think we might have some mutual interests." She nodded slightly before returning to her house, the curtains occasionally parting as the Watson brothers' SUV made another slow pass by our homes. The HOA inspection went exactly as I had anticipated. I strategically left for a coffee shop during the scheduled time, surveillance cameras running throughout my house. I'd spent years analyzing tapes like this. Each frame told a story. But this was attempted destruction in HD. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes, but it was more than enough to destroy their lives and Caldwell's operation if handled correctly. When I returned home, I pretended not to notice anything amiss, but secretly retrieved the planted evidence while wearing gloves. My hands trembled, not from nervousness but from suppressed rage as I carefully documented everything. I sealed the bags in evidence containers and called my former partner at the U.S. Marshal's office, Lisa Rodriguez. "I need a favor, off the books for now," I explained, detailing the situation. She agreed to meet me and have the substances tested through unofficial channels. Her message came back the next day. "It's actual narcotics, Saint. Not just fake stuff to frame you, real drugs. This elevates everything to multiple federal crimes." The knowledge that they were willing to plant actual narcotics to frame me was staggering. These weren't just corrupt HOA officials, they were potentially involved in drug distribution as well. The next morning brought the culmination of their plan. Local police, including Officer Jenkins, arrived with the Watson brothers, claiming they had received an anonymous tip about drugs in my home. As they demanded to search my garage, I felt a moment of genuine fear. Even knowing I had removed the planted evidence, the situation was dangerous. If they planted more during the search or claimed to find something regardless, it could end my career. I maintained a calm exterior as I asked to see their warrant, which they reluctantly produced. The document was legitimate. Judge Marcus Wilson had signed it. The name struck me immediately. Wilson. Margaret's son worked in the prosecutor's office. The conspiracy was wider than I had initially believed. That night, I hit my emotional rock bottom. In my dimly lit living room, surrounded by case files and evidence, I hurled my coffee mug against the wall, watching it shatter. The stress of maintaining my cover while building a case was taking its toll. For the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, I let myself be truly vulnerable. As I called my father, a retired judge. "Dad, I don't know if I can fight this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "They've got the police, the prosecutor's office, the HOA, everything. Maybe I should just sell and go." My father's voice was steady on the speaker. Son, you've spent your life making sure the law works for everyone. If you walk away, who fights for the next person they target?" His words hung in the air as I sat in silence, staring at a photo of myself in my Marshal's uniform on the day of my graduation. The next morning, I stood before my bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection as I shaved with precise, deliberate strokes. Gone was the uncertainty, replaced by cold determination. I straightened my tie with the same methodical care I'd used preparing for a high-risk operation. "They picked the wrong person to frame," I said to my reflection. It was time to go on the offensive. I began mapping out the corruption network on my dining room wall with the same precision I would use for a major case at work, connecting players, documenting incidents, and forming a federal case. Red strings connected photos, documents, and timeline events, with Richard Caldwell's photo in the center, now marked with a large X. I called Lisa, my voice steady and professional. "I need to file an official report. We've got criminal impersonation of law enforcement officers, breaking and entering, falsifying evidence, attempted framing of a federal agent, and what looks like a real estate fraud scheme. This is now an official investigation." As I hung up, a text arrived from Eliza next door. "I've been watching too. I'm a forensic accountant. I've been tracking their financial movements for months. We should talk." The pieces were coming together faster than I had anticipated. Later that day, I met Eliza at a cafe 20 miles from Oak Ridge to ensure privacy. She slid a flash drive across the table. "Richard Caldwell's investment group has acquired 17 homes in the neighborhood over 3 years, all after HOA harassment campaigns," she explained. "I moved here on purpose after they forced my parents out of their retirement community using the same tactics. I've been building this case for a year." Her eyes were clear and determined, no longer showing the fear I'd seen before. "The Watson brothers have criminal records that were somehow expunged," she continued. "Their previous charges included impersonating law enforcement. Caldwell must have pulled strings from his police chief days to clean their records. With Lisa's help, I created a secure communication network with trustworthy neighbors who had also experienced harassment. Edward Graham, a 70-year-old retired judge who walked with a cane, not from age, but from an accident that occurred shortly after he challenged Richard at a meeting, provided years of documented HOA abuses. "I was a judge for 30 years. I know legal when I see it," he said, handing over audio recordings of Richard boasting about forcing out undesirables during a private board meeting. "The evidence was damning, but we needed more to ensure the case would be airtight." Meanwhile, Richard noticed my strategic retreat and became suspicious. Rather than backing off, he escalated, convinced that one more push would break me. The HOA sent a $10,000 fine for multiple sustained violations and threatened property lien action, giving just 72 hours to pay. The document resembled a court summons designed to intimidate and overwhelm. It was his most aggressive move yet, but it only strengthened my resolve. The case was building, and soon, Richard Caldwell would learn what happens when you target a federal officer who specializes in building cases against corruption. That night, I canceled my trip to Arizona. Again. I was supposed to fly out for my niece's piano recital. Her mom had sent a video of her practicing Claire de Lune with a little pink bow in her hair. The ticket sat unused on my kitchen counter, next to a wrapped gift I'd never deliver in person. I didn't move here to be a hero. I moved here for peace. But peace doesn't come when you're the only one with your eyes open. I sat down, turned the ticket over, and wrote one word on it: leverage. If they were willing to take my freedom, my job, even my family time, I'd take everything they'd built. My mail started disappearing. Crucial documentation from my attorney vanished before I could retrieve it. My security cameras caught Kyle Watson stealing it while in his fake uniform, the morning sun glinting off his counterfeit badge. I reported the mail theft to the postal inspector, adding another federal offense to the growing list of charges. Using my federal resources, I ran background checks on everyone involved in the harassment campaign. The results confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Richard Caldwell and Officer Sarah Jenkins shared financial accounts. She wasn't just cooperating with the harassment, she was financially benefiting from it. The web on my investigation wall grew more complex, with financial records now added to the timeline and new connections revealed. My cameras captured them in crystal-clear 4K video wearing their fake police uniforms with federal-style badges, approaching my car again. "Marshal Harold needs to learn his place," Trevor said clearly to the camera as they slashed my new tires. The evidence was perfect. They were on video committing multiple federal offenses while impersonating law enforcement officers. I forwarded the footage to Lisa immediately, who confirmed it was more than enough for federal charges. We were close to having sufficient evidence for arrests, but I wanted to ensure we caught everyone involved in the conspiracy, not just the foot soldiers. As I compiled evidence for federal charges, Richard made an unexpected move. He scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to vote on the immediate foreclosure of my property, claiming ongoing criminal activity threatening the community. A notice of emergency action that resembled a federal seizure notice appeared on my door, placed there by the Watson brothers, who pounded aggressively to ensure neighbors witnessed what appeared to be an official action. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were mimicking federal procedures while committing federal crimes. Though the HOA had no legal grounds for foreclosure, the process itself could cause significant disruption and potential harm to my reputation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, just 3 days away. The timeline was accelerating, and we needed to be ready. I contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, my voice calm but forceful as I laid out the case. "Yes, sir, I believe this qualifies as a color of law violation. I have everything on video, including their use of counterfeit federal identification." The agent on the other end whistled low. "This is extensive, Marshal Harold. We'll need to coordinate a response." Within hours, a joint task force was assembled, combining resources from the U.S. Marshal Service, FBI, and Postal Inspector. The plan we developed was both simple and elegant. Let Caldwell and his crew believe their emergency foreclosure meeting would proceed as planned, while wiring the community center with legal surveillance. We would catch them in the act of abusing their authority and attempting to defraud residents. Working officially with federal authorities now, I helped design the sting operation from my home, which had transformed into a command center complete with encrypted communications and surveillance equipment. The strategy required me to appear vulnerable and defeated to draw them into overreaching. I methodically removed photos from my investigation wall, carefully preserving the evidence while making my home appear as if I was preparing to move out. I deliberately parked my Porsche in the driveway again, the damaged paint and new tires a visual lure, appearing to have given up the fight. The Watson brothers drove by repeatedly, clearly reporting my apparent surrender to Caldwell. The trap was set. I approached Diane Miller, an HOA board member who had shown signs of discomfort with Caldwell's methods. Her husband had lost his contracting job after crossing Richard, and their teenage son had been falsely accused of vandalism when she questioned a board decision. "They threatened my son again last night," she whispered, hands shaking as she accepted the recording device I offered. "I can't live like this anymore." She agreed to wear a wire to the private board meeting Caldwell always held before community votes, where he typically instructed board members how to vote. Her courage was remarkable given the risks she was taking, a reminder of why this case mattered beyond my personal grievance. The night before the emergency meeting, Trevor and Kyle took the bait. Under pale moonlight that illuminated their fake badges, they slammed a fake federal foreclosure notice onto my windshield, making sure the entire street heard. "Federal boy will have real problems," Trevor said loudly, clearly playing to what he thought was just my security camera. They placed a fake federal warrant on my windshield, a document that closely resembled legitimate federal paperwork, not realizing every word and action was being recorded by both my cameras and FBI surveillance teams positioned in unmarked vehicles nearby. The evidence was damning and would be more than enough to secure convictions. The pre-meeting board gathering in Richard's luxurious home office provided the final piece of evidence we needed. His walls were covered with photos of himself shaking hands with politicians, creating an impression of connections and influence. Unaware that Diane was recording, he laid out his real estate scheme explicitly. "Once we push Harold out, we'll have the entire East Block. The development company pays triple once we have a complete parcel." He tapped a large map showing properties marked for acquisition, a physical representation of his corruption that Diane managed to photograph discreetly. The recording captured every detail of the conspiracy, including how they had targeted previous homeowners and which officials were being paid to cooperate. The case was now complete. All that remained was to spring the trap at the emergency meeting. As I prepared for the confrontation, I felt surprisingly calm. After weeks of maintaining my cover and building the case methodically, the end was in sight. I checked my weapon, something I hadn't carried since moving to Oak Ridge, and placed my Marshal's badge in my pocket. Tonight, Richard Caldwell and his fake cops would learn the difference between pretending to have authority and actually possessing it. The Porsche sitting in my driveway, still bearing the scars of their harassment, had become more than just a car. It was the bait that had lured them into a federal trap. Sometimes justice requires patience, but it always arrives eventually. And for Richard Caldwell, justice was coming in just a few hours. The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was packed for the emergency HOA meeting. Residents filled every chair, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and unease. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Richard Caldwell took his position at the elevated desk, wearing a suit with an American flag pin, another symbol of false authority. The Watson brothers flanked him in their mock police uniforms, hands resting on their utility belts, standing at parade rest like guards. I sat quietly in the back row, dressed in casual clothes that concealed my wire and service weapon. Federal agents were positioned throughout the building and in unmarked vehicles outside, all connected through encrypted communications. Everyone was in place for what would be the final act in Caldwell's reign of neighborhood terror. This emergency session of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is now in session, Caldwell announced, bringing his gavel down with theatrical force. His voice carried the practiced authority of his former profession as he addressed the crowd. We face an unprecedented situation requiring immediate action. One of our residents has engaged in activities that threaten the safety and property values of our community. He looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of contempt and triumph. Marshal St. Harold has terrorized our security personnel and violated every standard of community decency. The board has documentation of multiple violations, including evidence of illegal substances on the property. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as residents turned to look at me. I maintained a neutral expression, allowing Caldwell to dig himself deeper. We have prepared a motion for immediate foreclosure action under Article 7 of our bylaws, Caldwell continued, holding up a document that, like everything else in his operation, was designed to look official without having any actual legal standing. The board has reviewed the evidence and recommends unanimous approval. His practiced charm had taken on a sinister edge under the fluorescent lights as he played to the crowd's fears. We must protect our community values and the investments we've all made in our homes. When the time came for public comments, I approached the microphone, prepared to address the false allegations. Before I could speak more than a few words, Caldwell's gavel banged 3 times, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. "You've had your chances, Mr. Harold," he announced, his voice dripping with false regret. "The time for discussion has passed. We will now move to a vote." The Watson brothers moved toward me, clearly intending to forcibly remove me from the podium. Trevor reached for my arm, his hand touching the handcuffs on his belt in a clear threat. The room was completely silent, residents watching with a mixture of fear and discomfort. The back doors burst open with a thunderous bang that made everyone jump. Lisa Rodriguez led a team of federal agents in full tactical gear, real authority contrasting sharply with the Watsons' costume version. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of genuine authority. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Richard's desperate attempt to maintain control. "This meeting is a private HOA matter. You have no jurisdiction here." His voice cracked as agents moved methodically through the room. "Richard Caldwell, Trevor, and Kyle Watson, you are under arrest for multiple federal offenses, including impersonation of federal officers, mail theft, breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Lisa announced, nodding to agents who moved forward with handcuffs. Trevor and Kyle made a break for it, shoving past frightened residents toward a side exit, only to run directly into the arms of more waiting agents. Real handcuffs replaced the props on their belts as they were secured and read their rights. As Caldwell was being handcuffed, his carefully maintained mask of authority crumbled. "This is a mistake," he sputtered, looking around wildly for support. "I have rights, I have connections." When none of his supposed connections materialized to help him, he hissed at me as he was led past. "You think this is over? I have friends in this town you can't touch." His eyes darted toward the exit where Officer Jenkins was slipping out, making a frantic phone call. I nodded subtly to Lisa, who dispatched agents to follow her. I stepped to the podium, showing my marshal's badge to the crowd. "I apologize for the disruption," I began, my voice calm and reassuring. "I'm U.S. Marshal St. Harold. For the past several weeks, I've been building a case against Richard Caldwell and his associates for numerous federal crimes, including a real estate fraud scheme targeting this community. Anyone who has experienced harassment from the HOA under Caldwell's leadership is encouraged to speak with the federal agents who will remain on site to take statements." The room erupted in conversation as residents began to process what they had witnessed. In the days that followed, the full extent of Caldwell's corruption was revealed. Search warrants executed on his home and office uncovered evidence that the conspiracy reached the mayor's office. The mayor had been receiving kickbacks from Caldwell's development schemes and had pressured the police department to cooperate. Officer Jenkins was arrested, attempting to destroy evidence, and her financial ties to Caldwell were exposed. Judge Marcus Wilson was placed under investigation for signing warrants without probable cause. What had begun as harassment over a Porsche had exposed corruption at every level of local government. With the FBI fully involved, the operation expanded beyond what I had initially anticipated. Search warrants revealed the complete real estate fraud operation. Caldwell's investment group was working with a major developer to secretly acquire the entire neighborhood for a commercial complex, using the HOA as a weapon to force people out and acquire properties below market value. The case had grown far beyond harassment of a federal officer. It had become one of the largest public corruption cases in the county's history. And it had all started because they picked the wrong car to vandalize. The federal courthouse was packed for the arraignment of Richard Caldwell and the Watson brothers. They sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, a far cry from the authority figures they had pretended to be. As the charges were read, impersonating law enforcement officers, breaking and entering, evidence tampering, mail theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted framing of a federal officer, I watched their expressions from my seat in the gallery. The Watson brothers looked shell-shocked. Their false bravado completely evaporated. Caldwell maintained a stoic facade, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his understanding of the severity of his situation. When called upon to deliver my victim impact statement, I approached the podium calmly. Your Honor, beyond the personal harassment I experienced, this case represents a fundamental abuse of power and trust, I stated, my voice steady. Richard Caldwell and his associates created a shadow government within Oak Ridge Estates, using intimidation and fraud to force residents from their homes for personal profit. They impersonated law enforcement to terrorize law-abiding citizens. Looking directly at the Watson brothers, I delivered the line I had been waiting to say. You impersonated the law. Let me introduce you to the real thing. The irony was perfect. Their fake uniforms and badges replaced by prison jumpsuits. Their imagined authority shattered by the actual justice system they had mimicked. All three were denied bail, deemed flight risks due to the severity of the charges. The investigation expanded rapidly in the weeks that followed. The mayor and 2 city council members were indicted for their roles in the scheme. Officer Jenkins faced charges for abuse of authority and evidence tampering. The web of corruption that had ensnared Oak Ridge was being dismantled systematically, one arrest at a time. Former residents who had been forced out began filing civil lawsuits against Caldwell's investment group, seeking compensation for their His assets were frozen, and financial investigations revealed he had been nearly bankrupt, desperate for the final payoff from the development deal. His manicured lawn now sported a real federal seizure notice. The irony of authentic versus counterfeit authority made manifest. In a quiet moment at home, I stood in my garage beside my Porsche, running my fingers along the repaired paint job. It was never really about the car, I said to Lisa, who had stopped by to deliver case updates. It was about people thinking they're above the law. She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. You could have just moved, saved yourself the trouble. I looked toward my neighborhood through the open garage door, where children were playing freely without fear of the HOA patrol for the first time in years. Then who fights for the next person? Sometimes the battle picks you. The community organized a thank you gathering in the park, with former residents returning to share their stories. Previously silent neighbors now found their voices, speaking openly about the intimidation they had experienced. James Foster explained how the water main that destroyed his basement had been deliberately damaged by the Watson brothers as punishment for questioning an HOA fine. Eliza Chen revealed to the group that she had moved to the neighborhood specifically to investigate after her parents were forced out by similar tactics in another HOA Caldwell had managed. Sometimes justice needs a little help, she said, raising a glass in my direction. Even Margaret Wilson, the nosy neighbor who had started the harassment campaign, approached me awkwardly at the gathering. I was afraid to speak up, she admitted, unable to meet my eyes. After what they did to Judge Graham's knee when he questioned them, she looked away, ashamed of her complicity through silence. Thank you for having the courage none of us did. The HOA was placed under court-appointed management pending new elections, with transparency rules and oversight mechanisms put in place to prevent future abuses. 6 months later, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my driveway. My Porsche sat prominently parked, no longer just a luxury car, but a symbol of the community's victory over corruption. Children played freely in the street without fear, neighbors chatted comfortably across property lines, and there wasn't a fake security vehicle in sight. Despite my initial reluctance, I had been elected to the new HOA board, the residents insisting they needed someone with integrity at the helm. As the party wound down and guests departed, a letter arrived, delivered properly through mail this time, not taped threateningly to my door. The return address showed the federal correctional facility where Richard Caldwell was serving his sentence. "You may have won," he had written, "but was it worth making so many enemies?" I looked up at my neighborhood, former strangers now connected through their shared experience. A child waved from a bicycle, an elderly couple walked their dog without fear, Eliza raised a glass from her porch. My investigation wall was now empty except for a single thank you card signed by dozens of residents. I smiled, crumpling the letter and tossing it into the barbecue's dying embers. Actually, I said softly to myself as the paper burned, it was worth making so many friends. My phone chimed with a text message from Lisa. "New case, similar HOA scheme in Colorado. Interested?" I looked thoughtfully at my now peaceful home, my neighbors, my gleaming Porsche, a symbol of both what started the conflict and what was ultimately protected. The battle had awakened something in me, a new purpose within my Marshal role, fighting corruption that hides behind false authority. I took one last look at the empty investigation wall, ready to be filled again with a new case. The Porsche in the driveway, pristine and symbolic, caught the last rays of sunlight as I typed my response. "Send me the files." Sometimes justice wears a badge, and sometimes it drives a Porsche. Either way, it always arrives eventually.